You got the president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, says the institution needs to get bigger in order to get more and do more in the face of escalating global challenges. Banga was speaking today in Morocco at the opening press conference of the World Bank IMF annual meetings for 2023. Let's listen.
The first couple of things I picked up during these trips is the idea of intertwined challenges. And what I mean by that is that the effort to segregate challenges into poverty separately from pandemics, separately from food insecurity, separately from climate change. This idea doesn't work in real practice on the ground to people who are dealing with the way in which these challenges confront them and come together. It's almost like a perfect storm in some ways. So I was in Kenya and I had a chance to meet President William Ruto in my nomination days and met him a few times after that. But during the nomination, he said something to me that stuck with my childhood in India, which is that, when you are a farmer and you rely on rainfall to be able to produce multiple crops in a year, so when you get those multiple crops, you're able to have the surplus that allows you to have cattle. When you have cattle, you get dairy income. When you get dairy income, that's prosperity. You start hiring a farm laborer. And what do? You get your kids off the farm and into school, including, most importantly, the girl child. Guess what happens when you don't get that rainfall for 4 years, which is what Kenya has just been through. You don't get that second crop. You don't keep that cattle as a result. You don't get that dairy income. And what do? You get rid of the farm laborer. And what's next? You take the children out of school back on the farm, starting with the girl child. If you describe the importance of reducing poverty by including the education of children and getting them to be part of the future, you just turned that back with 4 years of issues with rainfall. And so talking about these as separate is just not the right way to think about it. You need to think about these issues as intertwined and complicated, therefore. That's why what we're trying to do in the course of this entire process of this annual meeting and seek approval from our governors is to redefine the vision of the bank to be that of eradicating poverty, but on a livable planet. And what we mean by livable planet is exactly these challenges of pandemics and climate change and food insecurity and fragility and those kinds of issues that we refer to. The second thing that came across very clearly is that climate change tends to mean different things depending on where you're coming from. If you discuss climate change as being only the avoidance of carbon-intensive growth, as in the emissions from energy generation principally, but also transportation and construction material, then that's one definition. But when you live in the global south, that's not their definition. Their definition is loss of biodiversity, forestry cover going, less rainfall, challenges with the soil degradation. See, that's their visual, that's their issue of climate change. And then it gets exacerbated with crisis events of hurricanes and weather events they can't deal with. So if you're in a Caribbean island, no matter the fact that you happen to be a middle-income country, one hurricane takes away double digits of your GDP. And when that happens, that's a crisis no matter what your per capita income at that time. And so I think climate change means different things to different people, and therefore being careful about investing money from both sides, both points of view, is kind of important. One of the things the World Bank is doing is to put 50% of its money that goes into climate work into mitigation, which is the avoidance of future heavy emissions growth kind of patterns, but also 50% into adaptation, which is all the other aspects of climate that I was just referring to. The third thing that I kind of came across was therefore a desire for the global south to feel that their voices were being heard in the manner in which development and putting money into their countries was being addressed. And it includes everything from the challenges with the debt situation that a number of countries are in, but it also includes how to prioritize and work in their countries. And so that gets to the mission of the bank, where we are, in addition to other things, very clearly emphasizing the inclusion, in particular, not excluding others, but in particular, women and young people. And why is that? Women, obviously, 50% of the world's population. If they don't participate actively in this economy, you cannot kind of move the world economy forward when half the population is watching you from the sidelines. The reality of labor force participation by women in the world is that it has not improved tangibly since 1990. We know that even in the developed world, they are not paid equally. We know that venture capital money...
Yeah, we're still in Morocco at the annual meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions. The new Fiscal Monitor report, which was released by the IMF, highlighted the key issues that policymakers face in addressing the challenge of climate change. Here is Vito Gaspar, the director in charge of fiscal affairs at the IMF, and he was speaking at the launch of the new report this afternoon.
Everyone, many thanks for your interest on fiscal policy around the world and on our work as reflected in the Fiscal Monitor. For all countries, balancing public finances has become increasingly difficult. Difficulties are created by growing demands for public spending, rising interest rates, high debts and deficits, and political resistance to taxes. But there are sharp differences across countries. On the one extreme, some countries lack the cash to pay for urgent spending and lack access to credit. On the other extreme, there are countries that do not face any immediate financing constraints, but where unchanged policies would lead to ever-rising debt. Moreover, many countries need tighter fiscal policy, not just to rebuild fiscal buffers, to respond to future shocks, but also to help central banks bring inflation down to target. Worldwide, debt levels are generally elevated and borrowing costs are climbing. Global public debt is expected to increase to more than 93% of GDP in 2023 and to rise onwards, mainly due to major economies like the United States and China. The increase is projected to be about 1% of global GDP annually over the medium term. Public debt is higher and growing faster than pre-pandemic projections. Excluding these two economies, the ratio would decrease by approximately 0.5% annually. Slower economic growth, higher interest rates, and pressures on primary deficits also help explain why global public debt would go above 100% of GDP by the end of the decade. Against this backdrop, the Fiscal Monitor dives into fiscal implications of the green transition. Current national objectives and policies will fail to deliver net zero with catastrophic consequences. In other words, large ambition gaps, the difference between countries' national defined contribution and what's required for Paris Agreement goals, and policy gaps, the difference between national targets and outcomes achievable under current policies, remain. The option of scaling up the present policy mix that relies on subsidies and public investment to attain net zero is projected to increase public debt by 45 to 50 percentage points of GDP for both advanced and emerging economies by 2050, compared with business as usual. The Fiscal Monitor shows that a combination of policy instruments can attenuate this most unpleasant trade-off. Carbon pricing is a central piece, but must be supplemented with measures to address other market failures and distributional concerns. Fiscal support is needed to help vulnerable households, workers, communities, and businesses to adapt. The Climate Crossroads report offers policy options to limit the accumulation of additional debt to 10 to 15% of GDP by 2050. This brings the scale of the problem down to a size that can be addressed by other fiscal measures. Often, countries with limited fiscal capacity, low tax revenues, and restricted access to market financing face substantial adaptation costs. They should prioritize and increase the quality of public spending, for example, by eliminating fuel subsidies. They should also strengthen tax capacity by improving institutions and broadening the tax base. The private sector is key to a successful green transition, so authorities should put in place a policy framework favoring private investment and private financing. In 2021 and 2022, the IMF backed tax capacity or treasury market development in over 150 member states. Chapter 3 of the Global Financial Stability Report covers climate finance in greater details. As COP28 nears, a global cooperative approach led by major players, including China, India, the United States, the African Union, and the European Union, would make a significant difference. A central element would be a carbon price floor or equivalent measures. Other important elements are technology and financial transfers and/or revenue sharing. The latter could bridge financial divergences across countries and contribute to achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, starting with the elimination of poverty and hunger. The IMF has a vital role at the center of the international monetary system. It supports sound public finances and financial stability as part of the global financial safety net.